All right, welcome back everybody for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at some pretty interesting stuff. We have a collection of decoded metaphors, and it seems like they might be hinting at some potential events surrounding January 20th, 2025.
Oh, wow.
It's all very cryptic and a bit like we're trying to solve a puzzle, trying to decipher the symbols, connect the dots to understand the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Likely I've got an expert speaker here with me who's fantastic at unpacking this sort of thing.
I'm excited to be here. It's going to be a fascinating case. We're dealing with a kind of symbolic language here, where it seems like somebody is using metaphors to maybe predict or influence future events. It's a bit like we're reading a coded message, and we're trying to understand the hidden meanings behind each of the symbols.
Exactly. And the central figure in all of this seems to be Stormfire, the gnome. And the decoded text suggests that this refers to Donald Trump.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty loaded image, isn't it? When you make that choice of words.
It is a powerful image for sure. I mean, Stormfire evokes a sense of power, but also unpredictability. It suggests somebody who can be destructive, but also a catalyst for change. So it really makes you think about all the different ways that people view him.
It does. And this idea of Stormfire reassuming leadership, combined with metaphors like the signing of the decree and the keys to the White Castle, seems to point towards a potential return to a position of power.
So is it safe to assume that these are metaphors for a presidential inauguration? Or could they be hinting at something else entirely?
Well, those are certainly the traditional interpretations of those symbols, but it's interesting that the specific location for this signing of the decree is never mentioned.
Yeah.
Presidential inaugurations usually happen at the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Right? So this omission could be significant. That's true. It almost feels like they're intentionally avoiding that traditional setting, maybe to emphasize that this isn't a typical inauguration, that something different is happening here. But then we have this curious image of the Golden Banana Trophy representing the U.S. presidency. It feels almost satirical. Like a commentary on the absurdity of power, don't you think?
Yes, it's a strange juxtaposition, using this almost comical image to represent such a powerful position. It could be a way of highlighting the contrast between the outward appearance of power and the reality of it, or even a warning about the dangers of getting caught up in the pursuit of power.
I'm also curious about Mr. Secure R and the emphasis on moving the ceremony indoors. It creates a sense of heightened security, almost like there's a hidden danger lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly celebratory event. So what are your thoughts on the security element?
Well, the presence of Mr. Secure R, likely referring to a security figure or agency, definitely suggests that there are perceived threats surrounding these events. And moving the ceremony indoors could be a way of protecting Stormfire from those threats. But it also creates a sense of isolation, almost like he's being cut off from the public.
It's interesting you say that, because later in the text we encounter the White Cat Pixies, described as white hats operating behind the scenes. Does this suggest that there are forces working to protect Stormfire from these unseen threats?
The mention of white-capped pixies definitely implies the existence of allies or supporters working behind the scenes. But it also raises the question, if there are white hats, does that mean there are opposing forces, black hats, so to speak, who might be trying to disrupt things?
And then there's the overlord structure, which is decoded as the deep state. This concept of powerful individuals operating behind the scenes, it adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation, doesn't it?
It does. The overlord structure suggests that there's a hidden power struggle happening beneath the surface. It makes you wonder who these overlords are, what their motivations are, and how they might be influencing these events. Are they working to support Stormfire, or do they have their own agenda?
Okay, so we've got our central figure, Stormfire, poised for a potential return to power, but surrounded by security concerns and these shadowy figures working behind the scenes. But then things take a turn. For the dramatic, with the introduction of the dragons, we have the orange flame dragon and the mist dragon, both representing potential disruptions. So can you tell us a bit more about these symbolic creatures?
Well, the orange flame dragon seems to represent a large-scale, chaotic event, something that would cause widespread disruption and demand immediate attention. It could be a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, or even large-scale social unrest.
That's pretty intense. And what about the mist dragon? It's described as representing more subtle disruptions, like disinformation campaigns. So how do you interpret that?
Think of the mist dragon as a cloud of confusion, and misinformation, making it difficult to discern truth from falsehood. It's a metaphor for how disinformation can be used to manipulate public opinion and sow discord. It's a much more insidious form of disruption than the orange flame dragon, but potentially just as impactful.
It's almost like psychological warfare, isn't it?
Exactly. It's about undermining trust and creating chaos by manipulating information. It's a tactic that's been used throughout history, and it's becoming increasingly prevalent in the digital age.
And it's not just dragons we have to worry about. There are also black spiders and tiny wasp-like spiders, both representing covert agents or saboteurs, working to undermine Stormfire and his potential return to power. What specific actions could they be taking?
Well, these spiders could be engaging in sabotage, espionage, or even targeted attacks. They represent those working in the shadows, using stealth and cunning to achieve their objectives. It's a reminder that not all threats are obvious or easily detected.
This is already a lot to take in, and we're only just scratching the surface of these metaphors.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we need to pause here and let our listeners process what we've discussed so far.
Okay.
We'll be back soon with part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore the potential countermeasures and outcomes hinted at in the decoded text. Until then, keep those thinking caps on.
Welcome back to our deep dive into these fascinating metaphors. Now, in the last part, we talked about the potential threats facing Stormfire. Now let's explore the possible countermeasures and outcomes suggested in the decoded text. It seems that there are forces at play that are trying to protect Stormfire and ensure a successful outcome for whatever events are being foreshadowed.
Yeah, you're right. We have the white-capped pixies, those mysterious white hats operating behind the scenes. But the text also mentions hermetic seal, visualization, and prayer as methods of protection. These seem a bit more unconventional, shall we say.
Yeah, these metaphors definitely suggest a more spiritual or symbolic approach to protection. It's as if someone is trying to create a protective shield around Stormfire, using the power of thought, intention, or even prayer. It's a fascinating contrast to the more conventional security measures represented by Mr. Secure R.
It makes you wonder about the mindset of the people behind these metaphors. Are they genuinely trying to influence events through these spiritual practices? Or are these metaphors more about creating a sense of hope or confidence in the face of potential threats?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's interesting to consider the role of belief and ritual in shaping events throughout history. People have used rituals and symbols to try and influence outcomes, whether it's a rain dance to bring rain or a political rally to inspire support. These metaphors might be tapping into that same human desire to control the uncontrollable.
That's a really interesting point. It speaks to the power of symbolism and the human need to find meaning in events, even chaotic or unpredictable ones. Speaking of chaotic, let's talk about the dragons again. We left off with the orange flame dragon and the mist dragon, representing large-scale disruptions and disinformation campaigns, respectively. Are there any hints in the text about how those threats might play out?
Well, the text does mention the village or domain being affected by the orange flame dragon. This likely represents the general public being impacted by some kind of large-scale crisis or event. It paints a rather unsettling picture, doesn't it?
It does, especially when you consider the potential for manipulation by the mist dragon, those disinformation campaigns we talked about earlier. It's easy to imagine how people could be swayed by misinformation and propaganda during a crisis, leading to fear, panic, and even violence.
And that's precisely why these metaphors are so concerning. They suggest a scenario where not only is Stormfire facing threats, but the public is also vulnerable to manipulation and harm. It raises questions about the stability of society and the potential for widespread chaos.
It's almost like they're warning us about the fragility of our institutions and the importance of being critical thinkers, especially in times of crisis. But in terms of specific outcomes, the text does offer a couple of contrasting images. The golden dragon versus the dark ritual. What do you make of those metaphors?
The golden dragon clearly represents a positive outcome, perhaps even a triumph over adversity. It symbolizes hope, strength, and the potential for positive change. On the other hand, the dark ritual suggests a more negative outcome, possibly involving manipulation, deception, and even violence.
So it's like a battle between good and evil, light and darkness, with the fate of Stormfire and the village hanging in the balance.
Precisely. And it's up to us to decide which path we want to follow, which outcome we want to create. These metaphors are a reminder that the future is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, both individually and collectively.
Those are some pretty weighty implications, and we've still got more to unpack. I think we're ready to move on today. Part 3 of this deep dive, where we'll try to synthesize everything we've discussed and explore what these metaphors might be telling us about the potential events of January 20th, 2025. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into these decoded metaphors. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've decoded individual symbols, explored potential threats and countermeasures, and even touched on the role of the public, the village, in all of this now. I'm really curious to hear your overall interpretation, expert speaker. What story do these metaphors tell when you put them all together?
Well, it's like we're piecing together a fragmented narrative, isn't it? When you assemble all these different pieces, the picture that emerges is one of a potential power struggle centered around the figure of Stormfire, likely Donald Trump and his possible return to a position of authority. But it's far from a straightforward path. You know, there are forces working to support him, forces trying to disrupt him, and then there's the village caught in the middle of it all.
It's a very complex picture with so many different players and motivations at play. We have these shadowy figures like the white-capped Kixies and the overlord structure operating behind the scenes. Then the more visible threats of the dragons, representing chaos and disinformation, and of course those covert spiders lurking in the shadows. It almost feels like a scene from a spy thriller.
Yeah, it does have the element of intrigue too, doesn't it? But what I find particularly fascinating is the way these metaphors blend the political with the spiritual. On one hand, we have these very real-world power dynamics at play, but then there's this element of belief and ritual with the hermetic seal, visualization, and prayer being used as a form of protection.
You know, that makes me think about how people often turn to faith or spirituality in times of uncertainty or crisis. Maybe these metaphors are reflecting a deeper human need to find meaning and hope in the face of potential chaos.
That's a very insightful observation, and it speaks to the power of symbols to tap into those deeper emotions and beliefs. You know, these metaphors aren't just about predicting events, they're about exploring the forces that shape our world, both visible and unseen.
And what about the ultimate outcome? We have these two contrasting images, the golden dragon representing a positive outcome, and the dark ritual suggesting something much more negative. It's almost like a classic battle between good and evil, light and darkness.
It is, and the way these metaphors are presented, it's not clear which force will prevail. It's left open-ended, which I think is quite deliberate. It's almost as if these metaphors are challenging us to consider the choices we make, both individually and collectively, and how those choices might shape the outcome.
So in a way, these metaphors are less about predicting the future and more about encouraging us to think critically about the present and the role we play in shaping the events to come.
Exactly. They're prompting us to ask ourselves, what kind of future do we want to create? And what actions can we take to influence that outcome? Are we going to be passive observers or active participants in shaping the narrative?
Wow, that's a powerful message. It's a reminder that even in the face of potential chaos and uncertainty, we still have agency. We still have the power to make choices that can influence the course of events. Expert speaker, this has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I encourage you to continue exploring these metaphors. Don't just accept the interpretations we've offered. Question them, challenge them, and come up with your own understanding. After all, the power of symbols lies in their ability to evoke multiple meanings and interpretations.
Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We hope you found this exploration thought-provoking and insightful. And remember, the future is not predetermined. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping its ending.